Thank you, James, for that nice introduction. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Hello, Larry.
Good to be with you, David.
Let's dive right in. I actually brought a little quote to read of yours. So there's been a lot of talk lately about Larry Summers moving to the left. And there's debate, is it a reflection of where the Democratic Party is moving post-Obama? Is it a reflection of where Obama's moved the party? I'm not positive about this, you would know. I believe I wrote the first ever Larry Summers moving to the left story. And the reason I've been amused by the recent discussion of it is that story appeared in 2007. And I'm going to read you a quote from yourself, because quoting your own writing in an article is the original sin of journalism. I'll quote you. "I think the defining issue of our time is, does the economic, social, and political system work for the middle class? Because the system's viability, its staying power, and its health depend on how well it works for the middle class." The title of that article was Larry Summers' Evolution, and it was basically about how you were thinking about these things in new ways. So I guess I want to start with, have you moved to the left? And if you have, what explains that? And it seems to me that it's not a recent development.
I don't know that left and right are helpful terms. I think there tend to be terms that lead to oversimplification. But I think you were right to note that over the course of the 2000s, I had become much more concerned with issues of inequality. I think that anyone who has watched the economy over 20 years should have different views today than they had in the early 90s. In the early 90s, inflation was a continuing issue. High capital costs and insufficient supply were pressing concerns. Today, nowhere in the industrialized world do markets expect 2% inflation over the next 10 years. They expect less. Demand shortfalls and excesses of saving are a problem almost everywhere. And interest rates are negligible. And real interest rates, on average, in the industrial world are negative. So it's a very different picture. In the early 1990s, the dominant reason why living standards had slowed, growth in living standards was not as rapid as we would prefer, was that productivity growth appeared very low. Today, inequality has emerged as a massive phenomenon. If you compare relative to 1979, $1 trillion more is going to the top 1% of the population, and $1 trillion less is going to the bottom 80% of the population. That represents 25% of the income of the bottom 80%. It represents $750,000 per person for the top 1%. So inequality has a salience and an importance that it didn't then. Whatever, you can debate the causes and the means in all kinds of ways, but the economy suffered a financial collapse of a kind that few expected in 2007. And that has to lead to a reassessment of how the economy operates relative to the assessment that one had before. One looks at the way and the extent to which basic public functions, whether it's collecting taxes, repairing bridges, or doing medical research, are being carried on, and compares that with the way it was done in the early 1990s, and the share of our society's income devoted to those things has gone way down. So it seems to me that if you had a constant set of values and you saw this substantial change in the set of challenges, and you saw what we've learned about the workings of the market economy in terms of producing inequality, in terms of producing financial crises, in terms of producing demand shortfalls, I don't see how a thoughtful person couldn't change their minds and evolve their positions. That doesn't mean that that everybody should have the same position. If you have the kind of values that the Koch brothers have, you could still easily have very, very conservative values, even in the face of all of that. If you have the kinds of values that I have, your judgments about expansionary fiscal policy, your judgments about financial regulation, your judgments about the progressivity of taxation, your judgment about the non-desirability of spending cuts and desirability of prudent public investments will all naturally evolve. So I've always thought Keynes had it about right when someone said to him, Mr. Keynes, what you're saying today seems different from what you're saying a few years ago. And he said, yes, when I see new information, I change my mind. And you? And so it seems to me it would be hard for anybody who was sentient, or should be hard for anyone who's sentient, not to have some views today that are different than they did 20 or 25 years ago. And for me, that's a kind of constant and ongoing process. And as you noted, in 2007, I was very concerned about what had happened to middle-class income growth, and was beginning to see, I certainly didn't see at that time the kinds of ideas about secular stagnation that I've spoken about more recently, but I had a concern even at that time about the fragile basis of our prosperity being based as much on debt and as much on rising inequality as it was.
The statistic about the bottom 80% and the top 1% sort of has at its core an assumption that the earnings that the top 1% are getting in some kind of real way are being diverted from the top 80%. That something has changed, not so that the earnings of the top 1% have taken off in a way that's independent, but that there is this pie and they're getting a larger share of it. Mechanically, how does that work? How is it that the income that's going to the top 1 or the top 0.1%, with a different kind of society, with a different kind of an economy, that same income could actually be going to a family making $40,000? I don't always completely see that connection.
I think that's an important question, and it's why I was careful in my phrasing. If we had the same total GDP, and if we had the same income distribution as we had in 1979, and I think one can overdo inequality. When I hear people who seem overly focused on it, I am led to ask them the question, suppose the United States had 30 more people like Steve Jobs. Would it be a good thing or would it be a bad thing? There's no question that the level of inequality in the country would be greater, but I think most of us would agree that the country would be a better place with more people like Steve Jobs rather than a worse place. So I don't think one can simply let the level of the Gini coefficient be the guide for policy. On the other hand, as I try to understand and try to think about the phenomenon of increased inequality, it's hard for me to understand why the tax system should be allowed to become less progressive over time in the face of rising inequality in pre-tax income. It's hard to see why we should be part of an international race to the bottom in corporate taxation at a time when the profit share in most parts of the world is increasing sharply. It's hard to see why, given these trends in inequality, the minimum wage should be today substantially below where it was in real terms when Ronald Reagan was president. I'm not aware that anyone was concerned about its disemployment effects during the Reagan presidency. Presumably the society has become somewhat more productive, and so one wonders why it should be substantially lower than it was at that time. It's far from clear to me why at a time when there's some growing evidence of increased market power leading to that, contributing to that higher profit share, why the general tradition and general thrust of antitrust enforcement should have trended downwards over the last generation. It's hard for me to see, in the face of this, why it's right that the difficulty of union organizing should have been compounded so much over the last generation. So I think there are a set of changes, which I just hinted at, some of which I think would actually make the economy function more efficiently, some of which I think would make the economy function more equitably, that in conjunction would contribute to reversing that $1 trillion transfer without meaningfully or importantly reducing the size of the pie. And to the extent that a more equal society is a society that would provide more equal opportunity and would be more successful in allowing talent of all kinds to rise to the top, it might actually contribute to greater economic efficiency and greater prosperity over time. But whether it's possible to fully reverse this trend towards increased inequality in a world where technology is changing things, in a world where globalization is changing things, in a world where markets are increasingly open and tending to reward market productivity, which may be unequally distributed. I don't know whether it all can be reversed, but I sort of don't think if you weigh 300 pounds, that's the question yet. I don't think you have to ask the question or spend a lot of time on just what the right target weight is for you. You sort of know which way you need to be moving, and I guess that's my reaction with respect to inequality now.
So more progressive tax system, higher taxes at the top, higher minimum wage, more union organizing, several other things. What about trade? Obviously, trade is sort of the topic, one of the topics of the moment in Washington right now. What do you think about the Pacific deal, and more broadly, what should we be doing on trade?
I quite some years ago concluded that my fellow economists, who in their enthusiasm for free trade tried to suggest that trade did not have any adverse impacts on inequality, were probably wrong. I think the right reading of the evidence is that relative to a world in which markets were closed, there is probably more inequality in the United States than there otherwise would be. There is also substantially higher levels of average income and substantially higher levels of purchasing power for most workers. But I think the great mistake that runs through most of the debate about TPP, and there's been a similar error in the debate about other trade agreements, is that they confuse the economics of trade with the economics of trade agreements. Reality is, and some people like this reality, some people don't like this reality, but it is reality, that the United States market is profoundly open. That we have, and have for a long time had, the most open market in the world. You can make an argument that we should try to change that we should try systematically to close our market. I think it's an unpersuasive argument, but it is an argument. That's not the argument people make. The argument people make is that we should be against trade agreements. And what that misses is the profound asymmetry in the trade agreements we have negotiated, whether you look at U.S. Korea, U.S. Panama, U.S. Colombia, or you look at the TPP. The reality is that there is vastly more market opening going on in the other countries than there is in the United States. So whatever it is you don't like about import competition, we're getting very little more of it. And what you do like in terms of job creation through more open markets for exports, we are getting substantially more of it. So my reading is that on economic grounds, but on a kind of mercantilist ground, that their barriers are coming down much more than our barriers, it is almost certainly a good idea to enter into these trade agreements. The one thing that is certain is that if we don't have TPP, we will have no new influence on labor standards, no new influence on environmental standards, no new influence on issues around currency. There's room for debate about just what the right way to approach those issues are, but if we don't have TPP, our market will still be open, their market will still be closed, and we will not have substantial influence on those issues. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with those who say that we need to be very careful that the negotiating interests we pursue in these agreements are the negotiating interests of the American middle class, and that we need to be very careful about using scarce political capital excessively on the interests of corporations who will take advantage of those interests in ways that do not confer significant benefits on U.S. workers. I think that's a legitimate concern, and I think those mistakes have been made in the past. I think President Clinton has recognized that the raising of the price of AIDS medicines in the name of intellectual property protections through the TRIPS provisions that were contained in the Uruguay round was a serious policy mistake. I think the lessons of that policy mistake have been learned, but I think the people who keep pointing out those risks are performing an important service. I also think there's another consideration that I would hope that people thinking about TPA now would consider. The United States of America has announced as a central tenet of its foreign policy a rebalancing towards concern with Asia. My judgment, that was an appropriate announcement. But whether it was an appropriate announcement or not, it has been a major thrust of American policy. The TPP is a crucial element of that. If the United States were to be unable to go forward with the TPP, it would do substantial damage to American credibility, given the extent of the negotiating effort that has gone into this, at a time when America does not have a surfeit of international credibility that it can afford to dissipate. And so I think on geopolitical grounds, it is more important than it might otherwise be that this initiative move forward.
One more from me, and then I hope we have time for a question or two from the audience. One of the issues that inequality raises is money in politics. We've got essentially now a system in which individuals can fund entire presidential campaigns, among many other things. Is money in politics one of these it was ever thus problems and we shouldn't worry about it too much? Or is that a real reason for concern about our democratic process, given the levels of inequality we have?
It probably was ever thus, but that doesn't mean, at least from my point of view, that it shouldn't be a major area of concern. I think it's a broader phenomenon. I'm actually less worried by the big money going into presidential politics, though that obviously has a set of problems because it's sort of visible. If anybody gets big money and they're successful, it sort of becomes very visible that they got big money, and it's much debated. I'm more worried about the things that happen in a quieter way. I'm worried that there were 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress and every member of the Senate working the Dodd-Frank legislation. And quintuple teaming tends to be a relatively effective tactic. And I think that is problematic. I'm worried about what might be called the shadow civil society sector, when highly moneyed interests are able to gain respect, gain hearing through their views through prominent institutions, prominent journalistic institutions, or prominent think tanks. I think those things do raise questions, and I think in the same way that journalism has, over a long time period, devoted itself to a whole set of procedures and discussions around the independence of journalistic content from advertising. I think that we need those kinds of reflections more generally as journalistic and intellectual organizations move into a broader set of spheres of writing white papers, of running conferences, of hosting symposia, because I think the usual answer that's given, what's usually said is, you really don't need to worry at all because whoever funded it doesn't have any control over the content. That's the explanation that's usually given for why all of this stuff is okay. But of course, the people who fund it tend to reason that if you accepted their money once, you'd be likely to accept their money again, and that if you offend them, they're unlikely to provide their money a second time. And Therefore, it's not really right to say that the money doesn't have an influence on doesn't have an influence on decisions. I don't know what to do. I believe in the First Amendment, but I think that if universities, if publications, if think tanks reflected more fully on all of this, it would be a good thing. It was certainly a kind of reflection that I tried very hard to drive with some success, but much less than total success during my time as president of Harvard, where I did a lot of things when I was president of Harvard that generated controversy and made me unpopular with some on the faculty. One of the ones that got less attention was I resisted the university taking a number of gifts or accepting a number of sources of funding where I felt that, on balance, the university's reputation was being arrogated for the benefit of a particular financial interest. And I guess I'd like to see, if I could presume to make a suggestion to our hosts and others, I'd like to see a bit more effort to allow institutions that represent the middle class but don't have the resources to be sponsors to nonetheless be provided sponsorship opportunities for forums of various kinds, so as to create somewhat greater balance in the public dialogue.
Kind of scholarship of sponsorship. Yeah.
That would be one way of thinking about it.
Do we have time for a question? We'll take one. Lacking an answer to that, I'll assume it's yes. Ma'am, in the front here.
Hi. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. And I think I want to say is that for everybody, whether you are economist or politician or what, if we can really use the definition of right and wrong rather than left and right, and then if we define the things right and the productive, then the other way, negative or disservice will be wrong. And we have to eliminate those disservice. Like the GDP, we are thinking more GDP is good, but not necessarily, because a lot of inside the GDP is a measurement of disservice. So if we say those disservice getting bigger and is better, is the most prosperous nation, that is wrong way. So if we can say negative, my question is, if you can really base on the definition of right and wrong, then eliminate those, let's say for police brutality or injustice, prison, or some kind of even minimum wage.
Thank you for your question. I join you in being for right and against wrong. I think it's important, though, to recognize that no one has a complete monopoly on wisdom in these things, and that some important aspects of economic policy do hinge on questions of values, and there's no reason why it should be assumed that everybody would have the same values. I think it was Pat Moynihan, but it might have been Barney Frank, who said that you're entitled to your own views, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think that if in our dialogue we could attempt to come to common understandings with respect to the facts, and then to identify our differences in values and move forward, I think that would be constructive in the economic debate. I also take your point to a point. about GDP being an imperfect measure. There's a famous quote from Robert Kennedy about how the GDP measures roughly everything except the things that are most important in our society: our love for our children, the quality of our marriage, the beauty of our skies, and so forth. And I think you're absolutely right. At the same time, maybe this is a good note to end on. The United States economy has grown over the last 5 years in round numbers by about 13%. Unemployment has declined by about 4.5%. Using a standard relationship that economists use called Okun's Law, the 4.5% decline in unemployment has contributed about 9% of economic growth. That's the cyclical improvement component of economic growth. What's left is 4%. 4% growth, underlying growth, over 5 years is, to put it mildly, not impressive. It is 0.8% a year. And I would suggest to you, whether it is combating inequality, protecting the environment, improving education, reducing the national debt burden, fighting poverty, supporting middle-class families, doing more for scientific research, maintaining America's strength in the world. If our growth rate over the next decade is not substantially better than it has been, and we will not get the same cyclical component going forward that we've had in the last few years, if we are not successful in raising that growth rate, it will be very difficult for us to achieve our national aspirations, however any of us might define them. And the GDP is, in that sense, valuable as a measure of what we have to spend and invest as a nation. Thank you for the chance to be with you.